Hello and welcome to another video. It's been a while since my last video, about 3 or 4 months. The last one was about John Bindon, and that got received quite well considering the channel is mostly about the Krays, although John Bindon was loosely associated with Ronnie and Reggie Kray as he'd done a bit of work for them. Today we are kind of back on Kray territory, and we're going to talk about the Webb brothers, Billy and Ronnie Webb. They could be classed as friends of the twins and their firm, although the relationship did turn rocky on a few occasions, which eventually ended up in a mass brawl deep in Kray territory at the firm's then hangout, the Old Horns Public House in Bethnal Green in 1968. I will mainly talk about the Webb brothers' escapades that involve the Krays. I think I will spare you all the full biography of Billy and Ronnie Webb. We will have events involving the Krays and their gang, and also what Billy Webb had to say about Ronnie and Reggie Kray. I will directly be quoting Billy Webb, so you can make of that what you will, and whether it is to be believed or not. The Webb family are mainly known to be from the North London area, mainly Tottenham, but they did have relatives scattered about in South London and the East End. The immediate Webb family was just Billy Webb, his brother Ron, and their mother Jessica. The Webb brothers grew up fatherless, as they never knew their father, as he had left them when they were at a young age. After the Webb family moved about a bit in their early years, they eventually settled in Princess May Road in Dalston, where the brothers attended Princess May Junior School, which is also in Princess May Road. This is a school today, still standing. Incidentally, just here by Princess May School, at the end of the road opposite, is the building that used to house the North London Magistrates Court on Stoke Newington Road, where the Kray twins and others appeared in 1950 at the age of 16 due to a fight outside Barry's Dance Hall in Narrow Way in Hackney. Billy and Ronnie Webb also attended Rowland Hill School in Lordship Lane in Tottenham. The Webb school years involved lots of fights and truancy, with Billy Webb even assaulting a teacher when he was aged 12. Around 1949, the Webb brothers started to frequent the Royal Dance Hall in Tottenham. The Royal Dance Hall was a popular hangout for the young people at the time, where they could meet friends and have a dance. The Royal also had a more sinister side to it, as it was also where young gangs would go and hang out, and they would glare at each other across the dance floor, spoiling for a fight. The Webbs by this time had acquired a bit of a gang themselves, and were often caught up in scraps with other gangs, where knives, coshes and chains were used. There was a favoured spot in the Royal for the top gang, and it was in the corner of the dance hall, and that was the part that was the most spacious and had the more plush furnishings. At that time, when the Webbs were frequenting the Royal, the gang operating that favoured corner were a gang called the Corner Boys. It wasn't long though before the Webb gang inserted their dominance and they took over the corner. Soon after the Webbs gang took over the corner, the Krays and their followers started to go to the Royal. The Webbs had heard of the Krays, and the Krays had heard of the Webbs. The Krays and their followers would sometimes arrive in the back of an army van. It was seen by the Webbs as a show of force. Billy Webb estimated at the time that the Kray gang consisted of around 20 people. Billy said, "We got to know some of them pretty well, and we got on all right with them. Many of them got to be well known in the later years. One was Ronnie Knight, who later married Barbara Windsor, and another was Kenny Lynch, the black comedian and singer often seen on TV. We became aware of the Kray twins soon after their first appearance in the dance hall. At first, I never paid them a lot of attention, and thought of them as a couple of actors out to impress people. All night long they sat poker-faced, glaring at everyone. They had their own little gang always close at hand, which proved that they didn't then, and never would, have the courage to fight on their own. This proved to be the case throughout their reign. The friendly atmosphere between the Kray gang and the Webb gang didn't last too long, as there was trouble there one night involving the Webbs and the Krays cousin Rita. Billy Webb describes Rita in his book Running with the Krays as a real stuck-up little bitch who was always generating a lot of trouble. According to Billy Webb, a friend of the Webbs had insulted Rita, and the Kray gang were coming over to the Royal on the upcoming Saturday evening to sort him out. Apparently, the friend of the Webbs asked Rita for a dance, of which she refused, and then insults were thrown. During the coming week, up until the Saturday evening, the Webbs made some battle plans. Billy suggests that there was already some tension simmering between the Webb gang and the Kray gang before the incident with Rita, and the Rita incident seemed to tip things over the edge. On the Saturday, the Webbs and their followers arrived tooled up, ready for what was to come. When the Kray gang arrived, a few of them peeked their head in the Royal and scanned the dance hall to see what the opposition was like. And then about half an hour later, Reggie Kray arrived with about 10 other fellows and approached Billy Webb. According to Webb, Ronnie Kray was absent and Reggie Kray had one of his arms in plaster. Billy Webb says Reggie brought up about his friend insulting the twins' cousin Rita and he wanted an apology. According to Billy Webb, it seemed that Reggie Kray did not want to fight and he put this down to Reggie's arm being in plaster. Billy Webb believes that Reggie Kray backed down from a fight because his twin Ronnie wasn't there and he had lost his bottle. The friend of the Webbs who had insulted Rita did apologise that evening, and that was pretty much the end of that incident. The Webbs' path in life kind of mirrors their peers, the Krays. Both were promising boxers, and for both sets of brothers, most of their national service was spent deserting or in an army detention centre. This wasn't exclusive to just the Krays and the Webbs though. Most young men that were set on the path of criminality went this route for their compulsory national service. During these days of army desertion, the Webbs got to know the Krays a little bit better. One new friend the Krays had tagging along with them on one meeting with the Webbs was Dickie Morgan. Billy Webb says Dickie Morgan was much feared as a street fighter, and they often stayed at Dickie's house in Clinton Road in Mile End. Most nights though of these desertions were spent at Lyons Corner House, which was open 24 hours a day. Billy Webb says he got on better with Reggie out of the two, but he noticed that it was Ronnie who made all the decisions and spurred Reggie on. He says Reggie seemed quite content to live in Ronnie's shadow. Billy said neither of them had a sense of humour, and most of the time they were sullen and poker-faced. Billy Webb said Ronnie was often referred to as Boot Nose due to Ronnie's large nose. This was more than likely said behind Ronnie Kray's back, although Billy Webb does say in his book that it was said to Ronnie's face with no repercussions. It was at these long days and nights at Lyons Corner House that Billy Webb says that he found out about Ronnie Kray's homosexual tendencies. At the time, Ronnie kept his homosexuality a closely guarded secret, and at the time it was still a criminal offence to engage in any homosexual acts. The law for this changed in 1967. Many young runaway boys went to Lyons Corner House in those days, and Ronnie was always eyeing them up and down and would go off and talk to them. But Billy Webb says there was always something sinister about these actions by Ronnie, and he made the boys feel uncomfortable and they would get away from him as soon as they could. The Webbs and the Krays also spent many nights at gangster Tommy Smithson's Spieler, where the Kray twins used to sleep on the top of snooker tables. Billy Webb says he chose to sleep in a chair. Around this time, Billy noticed Ronnie Kray getting more paranoid and started to see a more violent side to Ronnie Kray. He would lash out if anyone gazed at him for too long, or if someone was laughing and happened to look in his direction. Billy says neither of the twins were very smart, but Reggie was a bit more brainier and quicker than his twin Ron. After that initial meet and hanging out around with the Krays, the Webbs kind of distanced themselves a bit from the twins for a while. They still saw them and gave them the time of day, but never really hung around like they did. The Webbs' businesses seemed to be a bit of all sorts. Billy Webb was sentenced to 6 months for car theft and he served that at Pentonville Prison. But it wasn't all crooked. They had a business of selling large wooden tar blocks for people to put on their coal fires, and they worked from a yard in Wood Green. As with most gangs of the time, the Webbs also looked after a few clubs offering protection. According to Billy Webb, he was brought in to handle some affairs concerning Ronnie Kray's attack on Terry Martin in 1956 outside the Britannia pub in Shadwell, along with Bobby Ramsey and Billy Jones. In his book, Running with the Krays, Billy says, "Shortly after Bobby and Ronnie were nicked, I was approached by Reggie Kray whilst I was having a quiet drink in a pub called the Three Crowns, which I used in Stoke Newington. Reggie did not know my companions enough to confide in them, so he asked me if he could have a word with me in private. I left my friends and joined Reggie at a small table out of earshot from his companions and mine. He started the conversation by saying that I probably knew that his Ronnie had been nicked. I told him I was aware of the situation. He then went on to say that the guy, Terry Martin, who had taken the beating, could not be bribed or got at, and his brother was looking at a lot of bird. Seeing as I was off the manor and unknown to Terry Martin, I could fit him up and discredit him as a witness against Reggie's brother. I thought about the situation and all the possibilities and told him that I would have to involve other people who would insist on some money up front. He readily agreed. No price was fixed at the moment, but I did warn him that what he was asking wouldn't come cheap. I arranged to try and sort something out within the next couple of days. He suggested I meet him again at his mother's home, but I was against this for safety reasons and suggested we meet at the Three Crowns again in 2 days. Billy Webb went on to say, at the time I had every intention of fitting up Martin, as I had no time for villains who grasped on other villains because things went wrong. But at the same time, there was no way I would put myself out on a limb for Ronnie Kray. I didn't really need Kray money, but in any event, I would make sure I got my dues before I got Ronnie Kray off the hook. The Krays had a bad track record when it came to settling their accounts. I made a mental note of all the relevant things I would need to ask and know about Martin's drinking habits and so on. But in the meantime, our own livelihood was of paramount importance. The Kray matter would have to wait until we drew some money off Reggie before we could even consider getting involved. I put it out of my mind until the meeting that we had arranged. On the day of the meeting, Reggie was there before me and my brother Ron. Reggie was with 2 pals whom he left to join us at the bar. I told him we had devised a plan, but before the plan was put into operation, we would want full and final settlement. In the meantime, we would expect a few £100 for expenses, as other people would be involved. And seeing as I had no idea what Terry Martin looked like, the description of him and details of his haunts he frequented would be essential. He furnished me with the information and handed me an envelope which contained £300, which was quite a considerable sum of money in those days. I made it clear that the £300 we had received was for any expenses we would incur in setting this thing up. The plan was to fit Terry Martin up with a rape charge. I knew a woman who I could trust implicitly to go along with us all the way. She was 100% reliable and most of all could stand up to the strain of any police probe and interrogation to which she would be subjected. According to Billy Webb, this plan was to go ahead until he found out that Terry Martin was an innocent party in all of this, and the real target for the beating by Ronnie Kray and others was his brother Charlie Martin. This didn't sit well with the Webb brothers and their gang, so they stepped away from any agreement that they made with Reggie Kray. Billy Webb said, "Soon it was all over the place that we had turned the twins over, but we did not see it this way. We thought we had been misled." At the time, Ron and I were living in a flat we had at North Grove, South Tottenham. I heard Reggie was making all kinds of threats, but I never took much notice, as even he must have realised no one in their right mind could or would get involved. This was just another mark on the card of the Webb brothers as far as the twins went, the first being the insults by a member of the Webb gang directed at the twins' cousin Rita a few years previously at the Royal Ballroom in Tottenham. As we know, in 1957, Ronnie Kray was jailed for the attack on Terry Martin and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. Billy Webb said, "Everyone was pleased when Ronnie was put away, and although the Kray firm went on operating, fewer innocent people were attacked for no apparent reason. By now, Ronnie Kray was so paranoid that you couldn't look sideways at him without risking a beating. He nearly killed a Berwick Street doorman just for referring to them as the boys. And at the Old Horns public house, Ronnie gouged a man in the face with a pint glass just for staring him straight in the eye. This to Ronnie was a challenge. He once nearly killed a guy at a party because the guy threw Ronnie's coat on the floor. Shortly after Ronnie and Bobby Ramsey were jailed, I heard that some strangers were making inquiries as to where I was living. A bit later, I was alone and fast asleep in our flat, which was on the first floor of a private house in North Grove, when in the early hours of the morning, the door was kicked off and I was confronted by 4 fellas, all armed and lashing out at me with koshes and knives. Fortunately, I had taken the precaution of concealing a long-bladed knife under my pillow, but the odds were so overwhelming, I was fighting a losing battle. I managed to cut at least one of them, but I finally finished up needing over 70 stitches in my face and several more in the head wounds, along with bumps and bruises. Despite the ongoing friction with the Krays, the Webb brothers still drank in their company. Billy said, "We were using several pubs and restaurants for meetings and deals. One of these was the Mildmay Tavern, where we often drank with the Krays. Around this time, I was letting a young kid, about 17 years old, called Roy, sleep in the office in the scrapyard at Wood Green. He was unhappy at home and he did not get on with his mother and stepfather. Understanding his problem, it was natural for me to feel compassionate. One particular evening, we were in the Mildmay Tavern, about 4-handed, and we brought the young boy along with us. We had been in there about 20 minutes when the Kray twins came in with a couple of other guys. We said our hellos and they joined us in a drink. As soon as he saw young Roy, Ronnie Kray could not take his eyes off him. I noticed the boy was getting a bit worried at all the attention he was getting. Up until now, he had never met Ronnie Kray and he had no idea he was a homosexual. He became alarmed and confused at the way Ronnie Kray came to sit next to him and whispered to him. Like me, my brother Ron had noticed all the interest being showered on the young kid, so he decided to take the initiative by saying, "Come on, it's time we moved on," and we all rose from our seats and said our goodbyes. I noticed how peeved Ronnie Kray became when he saw us leaving. None of us mentioned that incident when we got back in the car. It seems the Webbs were forever doing wrong in the eyes of the Krays, and most people familiar with this story will know exactly where we are heading. But alas, the Krays and the Webbs still kept each other's company and done business together. But one racket that the Webb brothers didn't want the Krays and their firm involved in was a lucrative bit of business which saw the Webbs and their gang minding off a pornography smuggler who would smuggle pornography by the container load from Denmark. Billy Webb says, "The Krays had an inkling of what was going on, and seeing as it was so lucrative, they wanted to muscle in. As could be expected, I would not allow this. Inevitably, a quarrel started as Ronnie Kray assumed I could be persuaded into taking them in as partners. This could not be achieved and a war started. It began when we received an invitation to meet the twins and talk about the business. Many times we have got word that they were anxious to have a meeting with us. Ron and I discussed the possibility of a meeting with the Krays many times, but Ron was against it, and I, whilst I was not keen, was a bit more curious. One of the last times I had seen Reggie Kray was when I was having a visit in Wandsworth Prison, and he was visiting his friend Ozzy. Their visit ended before mine, and before leaving the visiting room, he approached me and asked how I was keeping. He was pleasant enough, and I spent a few moments with him before he left, and I was able to resume my visit. Although my brother Ron and I found it hard to tolerate Ronnie Kray and his domineering ways, we eventually decided we would have a meeting with the twins and hear what they had to say. It was set up in the Old Horns Public House in Bethnal Green, a Kray stronghold where they and all their friends congregated. We arrived at the pub with a couple of friends who were just ordinary working class fellas. We had been having a meal with them earlier on. One of them was a fella called Ian who knew the Richardsons. When we entered the pub, all the Kray firm were there in force, including a couple with whom I had several rows and arguments with in the past. One was a fella by the name of Checker Berry, who was married to Beryl Parks, an ex-girlfriend of my brother Ron. Berry had been an associate of the Krays since they were at school, and after Ronnie was certified insane during a period in Winchester Gaol, Berry would take him to stay in the country with farming friends to get out of things for a while. There was no love lost between me and Checker. As we entered, Ronnie Kray was sitting at the bar talking to Nicky, the youngest of the Lambriano brothers, who was about 20 and young enough to attract Ronnie. The pub was practically packed solid, but I did notice Scotch Jack Dixon, the one-time safe blower, Big Albert Donahue, Tommy Cowley, the ginger-headed gambler, and Chrissy and Tony Lambriano. To us, this was just a meeting, but although we were prepared for trouble, I knew Chrissy and Tony would not get involved, as their bottle had well and truly gone over the reluctant involvement in the killing of Jack the Hat. But there were plenty of others who would want to find favour in the Kray's eyes. When Ronnie Kray saw Ron and me and our friends enter, he ordered us a drink and started the conversation by saying he had heard lots of reports that we were doing well. Then Reggie joined us and said he had heard I was out of the nick some time ago. He asked who our friends were and I introduced them to him. Ronnie Kray then called me aside and told me he would have preferred that Ron and I had come alone, as they had some personal things to discuss with us. By now, I was getting the impression that he knew more about our operations than I had imagined, and that he had it in for me and Ron that night. Whilst Ronnie Kray was talking to me, I looked around to see where my brother Ron had got to, and as I glanced around the pub, I noticed most of the Kray's old firm were nowhere to be seen. Ronnie Kray then went on to ask if we needed any muscle now. I realised then that he was trying to worm his way into our comparatively safe operation, so I told him we had everything more or less sewn up. Suddenly he changed the subject and asked me how my family were, and there was a bit of a menace creeping into his voice. Again, he asked me what I thought of one or two of his men helping me and Ron out, to which I replied, "No, everything's under control." He was aware that I had been a friend of Cornell's and that the Richardsons had been in Wandsworth along with me. He then went on about the Richardsons getting sent down and the amount of time they got. After that, he said he knew Cornell was in my company on the day he got killed. By then, he was shown all the Ronnie Kray danger signs. His voice had almost become a whisper and his eyes had begun to bulge. I began to realise, because he wasn't getting his foot in the door with our various rackets, he was looking for an excuse to have a battle right there and then. And this wasn't to our liking, as we were outnumbered about 20-1. I thought I noticed, as he was talking to me, that he was motioning to members of his firm with his eyes. I was aware that many of his firm would relish the thought of having a dig at me and Ron, especially Checker Berry, who would enjoy the chance of putting one onto us. Ronnie then asked me what I thought about the Richardson sentence, and I replied, I think they've got a bad result. Charlie Richardson didn't merit getting 25 years, to which he said, well, it won't happen to us as we've got too much help. Then suddenly he threw a punch which I anticipated and blocked. I threw a shot back at his chin which caught him on the forehead and all hell broke loose. Young Nicky Lambriano tried to get out of the action, and our two friends were not fighting men and they had the sense to stand well clear. Fortunately, Scotch Jack Dixon and a couple of the others who had always been on good terms with us never threw a punch and remained neutral. The Lambrianos stayed on the sidelines. I looked around for my brother and I was fully aware that we were in for a battle for survival and had to keep to our feet. If we hit the floor, we would be killed where we dropped. Little ginger-haired Tommy Cowley came at my brother with a blade, but Ron hurled a stool at him. Thank God we had just had one drink, or things would have been much worse. Ron fought his way towards me, and together standing back to back, we managed to make our way out the door without losing our footing. We gave nearly as much as we got, but we were so overwhelmed we took a lot of punishment before, thankfully, we were able to make good our escape. Later, I was told that one of the twins had a shooter on him that night, but he had second thoughts about using it on us. I had several cuts and wounds, but Ron's wounds were much worse than mine. Can you imagine the feeling of escaping from the clutches of a homicidal maniac and his twin brother out of their minds on drugs and booze, not to mention their firm, many of whom wanted a piece of revenge? As well as being on the Kray firm, for some of them it was a personal matter over the years. If Ron and I hadn't kept on our feet and battled together to get out of the building, we would now both be nothing but another chapter in a book about the Krays. And it is, I am sure, beyond all doubt, that my brother, whom I was close to, would be alive today if he had not been for the beating he took that day in the Old Horns. When we got through the doors, it was pouring with rain. The blood was streaming down our faces from numerous head wounds we had received. When you are being attacked in a crowd situation like that, it's your head and hands that take most of the punishment. Our pocket handkerchiefs were soaking wet with a mixture of blood and rain. We had no headwear, and I could feel the rain pelting down into my head wounds. We made our way to the casualty department of the Children's Hospital in Hackney Road. So that is Billy Webb's version of what happened in the Old Horns pub in the early months of 1968. The Webbs had numerous injuries. Billy had a laceration of the right eyebrow and a laceration of the forehead just inside the hairline, and lacerations to the top of the skull, and a laceration on the left ring finger. His brother Ron Webb had lacerations to the top of his head, a black eye, and fragments of glass in his hair, but Ron refused further treatment. Although the injuries don't seem too severe, it was quite a bad beating by all accounts. I would assume that the Webbs were only saved from more serious injuries due to so many people trying to get their blows in. I think if it was just Ron and Reggie giving out the beating, then it may have been more severe. When there is lots of people trying to give a beating at the same time, it will just be a melee of fists, etc., with most not really connecting. It'd just be chaos. Strangely enough, Reggie Kray took no part in the beating. Only Reggie will know why he didn't get involved. I think Ronnie had more of an axe to grind with the Webbs. Things with the Kray firm and the Webbs had been building up for years, and it seems the pornography racket that the Webbs refused the twins getting involved in was the last straw. We have to also remember that the Krays were at their maddest at this stage of their criminal career. Reggie Kray still grieving over the death of his wife Frances, and only a few months since he stabbed to death firm member Jack McVitie. Ronnie, well, he was just being Ronnie. At this stage, he was as mad as a box of frogs. In 1969, after the Krays and their firm were tried and convicted, The Webb Brothers appeared in front of the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board because of the permanent damage that had been done to them in the Old Horns in early 1968. Billy Webb said of this, "I know it was said that we should not have complained to the Criminal Injuries Board because there is a code of conduct in the criminal world that it is wrong to make statements to the police. But when I had seen my brother taking a beating so terrible that he never fully recovered, all I wanted was revenge. I was eaten up with hatred. All the so-called criminal codes of conduct amounted to nothing." Billy Webb does not elaborate in his book on the outcome at the Criminal Injuries Board, so I don't know if they got any compensation or anything. Despite the Old Horns beating, Billy Webb found himself visiting Reggie Kray at Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight. Billy Webb's hatred was more directed at Ronnie Kray. As we know, Reggie never took any part in the violence handed out to the Webb brothers. Nevertheless, the hatred for Ronnie Kray didn't stop Billy Webb visiting Ronnie when he was moved to Broadmoor in 1979. Soon after Ronnie Kray was sent to Broadmoor, I received a message from Reggie that Ronnie wanted to see me. Visits at Broadmoor were held in a large building that is also used for staging concerts. When he entered the visiting room, I was shocked at what I saw. Believe me, I had to take a second look to be sure it was him I was seeing. I could only describe him as a shell of the man I'd seen. He'd lost several stones in weight and looked fragile. It was obvious that the clothing he was wearing was not his own. His jacket was tight and his trousers were 2 inches too short. He looked like some sort of witch's brother. These visits to Ronnie became like a walking tightrope, for he knew that I and members of my firm were collecting money from establishments that he and his brother had pioneered when they were at liberty. He would accuse me of this and I would become indignant at his insinuations, but he was always anxious to keep friendly with me and Ron. In July 1984, Billy's brother Ron died. Billy always blamed the violence at the Old Horns for Ron's early demise. In the years since the beating at the hands of the Krays and their firm in 1968, Ronnie Webb had suffered from bad headaches and migraines. According to Billy, his brother Ron just dropped dead one day with no real warning. Billy Webb said, "His death increased my hatred for Ronnie Kray, this raving homosexual safely locked in Broadmoor, who was the cause of my brother's death. Of course, I have lost pals who have been shot or stabbed to death, but Ron was my flesh and blood. Anyone who said anything disrespectful about him became my target for vengeance, and for weeks after Ron's death, I went about being antisocial to many people, causing all manner of problems, as I could not handle my grief now that my brother was gone. Finally, I decided I would go to Broadmoor Hospital and get my vengeance." Ronnie Kray knew the hatred I felt towards him. When my brother died, he was kept well informed by his cronies and his hangers-on as to how I was feeling. I knew that if I used my real name to visit him in Broadmoor, he would block the visit, so I used the name of Houston to gain access. When I entered the visiting room, he must have known why I was there, for he went as white as a sheet. But before he could do anything to stop me, I steamed straight into him, a right-hander launched with all my might and venom. Within seconds, the guards pounced on me and rescued him. I was dragged out screaming obscenities at him. I was then taken to the office and questioned, but after a while I was allowed to leave Broadmoor. We can't really be sure about the fact of this incident that Billy Webb describes. We have to take Billy Webb's word for it, as there was no other witnesses to come forward saying that they were there. I don't think we can rule it out entirely. Billy Webb, racked with grief over the death of his brother Ron, and mainly blaming Ronnie Kray for it, and the ease of access to get to see Ronnie Kray in Broadmoor, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that this incident did happen. Ronnie Kray would have been very medicated in Broadmoor, so he wouldn't have been at his sharpest to fight back. Like lots of the things concerning the story of the Krays, we will just never fully know. Billy Webb was later interviewed for a 1990 documentary called Still Krays After All These Years, where he was asked about the possible release of the Krays in the near future.
One of those closely involved with the Krays in the 60s was a man called Billy Webb. 20 years later, Billy Webb visited Ronnie Kray in Broadmoor and punched him in the face. The press reported the incident as a culmination of a gangland vendetta, but Billy Webb saw it, quite simply, as a revenge attack. He claimed his brother, who had died recently, never fully recovered from a fight he'd had with the Krays. We went to see Billy Webb, and our researcher asked him what had actually happened between him and the Krays 20 years ago.
We'd like to ask you what you think of the Kray twins.
What I think?
Well, how do you feel about the Kray twins, given the fact that they've had some influence in your past?
How do I feel? I don't know. I'm not with you. How do I feel?
Well, what's your opinion of the Kray twins?
I don't want to get involved. I don't want to get involved. I don't want to get involved.
Is there any reason why you don't want to get involved?
I prefer not to get involved.
Is there any reason why you would prefer to keep out of it?
We'll just let sleeping dogs lie. All right?
Could I ask you, how do you feel about the prospect of the Krays' release?
It's not in my hands, is it? It's in the judge's hands. It's 30 years.
Can you tell us a bit about when you first met the Krays?
No, I don't want to go into nothing.
Do you fear the Krays coming out?
Do I?
Do you fear the Krays coming out?
No, not personally, no. I don't want to make no waves, can't you understand?
Unfortunately, I don't have any information on if Billy Webb is still alive or not. Everything Billy Webb seems to have stopped at his book, Running with the Krays, that was published in 1995. The attack on the Webbs in early 1968 was, in my opinion, a bit unjust, but what can be justified when it comes to the Krays and their violence or murders? It was more than likely born out of Ronnie Kray's jealousy towards the Webbs getting a nice bit of money at the time. Ronnie Kray probably felt that he and his firm were entitled to be brought in on that bit of business. After all, the Webbs were friends and there had been shared business interests before. Reggie Kray taking no part in the violence could mean that he also felt it was unjust, or it could just have been that he saw the big melee of fists and glasses and kicks of half the Kray firm and just decided he was not needed. It is quite telling though that Billy Webb never really showed much malice towards Reggie Kray in the later years. That malice was firmly aimed at Ronnie Kray, who he put the sole blame on for his brother's early death in 1984. Make what you will of Billy Webb punching Ronnie Kray in Broadmoor. Without witnesses to the incident, we are just left with Billy Webb's word. I don't think there's much more I can say on the Webbs and the Krays. It's not the definitive video on the life of Billy Webb, as I wanted to mainly concentrate on the Webb Brothers' business and relationship with the Krays. And it's a shame that I can't offer you anything on if Billy Webb is still alive or not, or anything on his life after his 1995 book, of which most of the information on this video is plucked from. But I do hope you have enjoyed this little look at the Webb Brothers and their interactions with the Krays and their firm. There was more that could be said, but I'm aware that my videos are generally quite long and you really don't want me going on for too long, and I think this video is long enough. So that's about it for now. I hope you enjoyed the video and I will catch you again next time. Thank you.